Today, we're going to be looking at chapter 2. So we've done lots of work on chapter 1, or if you're writing non-fiction, for your introduction. But at some point, we have to leave chapter 1 behind and move on to chapter 2. Now, remember at this stage, you're not aiming for perfection at the beginning of your book. You're just beginning writing, you're finding your way into the book. So even if you don't think your chapter 1 or your introduction is perfect yet, give yourself permission to move on. By doing this course, you're already streets ahead of all the people out there who just blindly stumble into their chapter 1 or the introduction and have no idea really what's going on. So you've already kind of eliminated all those potential pitfalls and those mistakes that you could have been making. So look at yourself and look at your achievement and feel really happy with what you have done so far. Like I said, there's loads of stuff out there for the chapter 1, how to begin, what makes for a strong opening, your hook, etc., etc. You know, we understand with both fiction and non-fiction that this good opening chapter or the introduction just sets the tone for the whole of the book. It sets up the book in terms of fiction, it gets the concrete goal kind of going, and in terms of non-fiction, it just outlines what to expect from the book, what the reader can get from it, and an invitation to read on. However your chapter 1 or your introduction ends, it's basically this sexy kind of seduction that wants the reader to keep reading. So what's the advice from chapter 2? You know, ultimately chapter 1 will probably be the one that you end up rewriting, 10 times. But where should the second chapter start? I'm going to talk about non-fiction really briefly, and then I'm going to talk about fiction. So if you're writing fiction, you can just fast forward for a couple of minutes and pick me up there, unless you wanted to watch. But non-fiction, so this is really comes down to the structure that you've already established for your book. And I think when it comes to non-fiction, it probably is more important to get your structure sorted up front before you start. With fiction, you can wing it a little bit, but with non-fiction, you probably do need to know. So when you've decided what your structure is, be it like the inspirational memoir, be it topic by topic or step by step, or be it topic by topic or step by step, which features some of your memoir, which then become what we call maybe a teaching topic book, a teaching memoir. Once you've kind of got that framework, and then you maybe have created a chapter plan, i.e. a list of chapters for your book where you're clear that each chapter has X teaching point or tells this story. Once you've got that listed, then let's say you've got 10 chapters, then it's pretty much easy then to have those 10 chapters and then put them in some kind of like narrative order, particularly if your book has got a narrative arc, and then pretty much each chapter then follows the same format, more or less. And that format is quite similar to your introduction. So the internal structure of your second chapter is very similar to the internal structure to your 7th chapter. So let's run through it briefly, and there will be a handout, so you don't need to make notes and panic. First of all, each chapter is going to have an internal structure, and it pretty much have the same internal structure. I would recommend pivoting each chapter around an anchor scene. Remember, we really would have written that in the introduction if you'd followed those kind of suggestions. The anchor scene happens in real time and something that you can show. And the anchor scene could maybe generally is the pain point of each chapter. And remember to ground it in a clear time and space and focus on showing and not telling. Use of the senses, action and dialogue will be really good here. Your own chapter then has a mini narrative from pain point to the solution. So whereas you started with the anchor scene, just like in the introduction, you can then move into the narrative context of that anchor scene. So let's say we're talking about the breakup, and this particular chapter is teaching you how to, I don't know, make friends or join a support group after the breakup. So you would start with the anchor scene, which is the pain point of being really lonely and kind of tearing your hair out and eating box after box of chocolates. And then the narrative context of that would be the weeks in which you've just isolated yourself and felt really sorry for yourself. And then you would move on to the solution, which would be, in your case, going out there, joining a support group or joining an online group or whatever it is that you did. And then you finish off the chapter, maybe if you wanted to, with teaching points. Teaching points could be bullet points, exercises, meditations, etc. That's a really conscious decision that you need to make. Some people don't want to have teaching points. They would rather the teaching points are just in the language and in the contextual information that they're giving, rather than actually separating them out into specific exercises or teaching points. That's for you to decide, and that's for you to work out what kind of book that you like reading and the kind of book that you really want to be presenting. Other suggestions for your internal structure would be to use subheads to break it up. Otherwise, there's quite a lot of dense information. And when we use subheads, don't just be really functional. Try to use imaginative, eye-catching subheads. Some people use case studies and examples and things like that. But if it's just your story that you're focusing on, you might not need that. You're just focusing on your story, the teaching points of your story, interspersed with a bit of subheads. Remember also, final tip, to use shorter sentences and paragraphs if you want a quicker read. Don't have too much density on the page. Keep the use of dialogue and keep the use of long paragraphs to a minimum if you can, because then it makes it a more engaging read. And really focus on the style. We'll be talking about voice and style in a different video, but think about how personable do you want it to be, or how formal or how informal. Those are considerations that you can think about. So that would be the rough internal structure from each chapter, which is very similar to the internal structure of your introduction anyway. But the main thing to do first is to create a list of teaching points in different chapters, and then you can follow it through sequentially. Fiction. Now, let me just see. Oh, I don't have a minute thing. It doesn't tell me how long it is, though. I was going to kind of make a note of the minutes. I can do that later. But fiction, jazz hands. So fiction, where should a good second chapter start, and what should it contain? First of all, let's look at where a second chapter should start. It can start at the time and place of the opening chapter of the ending of chapter 1. So let's say the ending of chapter 1, the doorbell rings and Michael's about to open it, and then when he opens it, he's expecting when he opens at the end of chapter 1, maybe it's his ex who's come back from the dead, and that's how chapter 1 ends. And then chapter 2 would begin literally followed on sequentially from chapter 1. You could also have a twist. The doorbell goes at the end of chapter 1. He's expecting it to be his daughter, and then that's what we think happens. And then when the door opens, it's some guy in some sort of fancy dress kind of costume or something like that. So you can just end it. You can just follow it on sequentially, or you can, particularly if you have ended chapter 1 on a hook, that's when you could really follow it on in the same time zone, as it were. Chapter 2, you could also start with the introduction of a new character, a new scene, something unrelated completely. It doesn't need to be sequential, as in following on directly from chapter 1. Sometimes it's really good not to give the reader what they expect. You want to keep them on their toes. So it's okay to literally turn your back on what happened in chapter 1. If you're thinking one of those really complicated books that they've got lots of kind of like half a dozen story threads, and then gradually weave them together as the book goes on, that's kind of where that really works well. But also when I talked about my book, I had, the end of the first chapter in mind is where they're on a plane heading to Norway, but the next chapter doesn't kind of continue with them on the plane landing. I pick up the next chapter, and by that point they're actually on the boat on the way to the island. So we've got the time jump, so you can have time jumps and still pick up the main character's story, but maybe like 2-3 days or hours later, if relevant. Don't worry about the connections between the two chapters and how one starts and how one's ends. You then can fill in the blanks of how they got there in the course of the second chapter. I really don't suggest flashback or backstory. Flashback is a complete no-no. I don't think it's the most effective thing that you can do in fiction. But if you absolutely have to have flashback, you would use it at the beginning of chapter 2 to sort of suggest maybe how chapter 1 got to how it got to. First chapters, remembered, are really in the now, but the before stuff, the backstory, can potentially come in chapter 2. So if you're not using flashback, which I don't recommend, but you want to introduce some backstory can be woven in chapter 2. But don't do it in a big chunk, do it subtly. A good way to begin chapter 2 is maybe with dialogue. You can maybe go with the inner thoughts of your lead character, your main character, which you've established in chapter 1, or you could just go straight into dialogue. Hear somebody's voice, overhear some talk on a train or something like that, or maybe the dialogue between the main character and a new character. That's a good thing to happen, have like dialogue happen. That's how I started my chapter 2, actually. It was with the dialogue from a new character that I'd introduced talking to my main character. You can start with the unexpected. You don't necessarily want your readers feeling really comfortable, like I've already said, and you don't want them predicting everything that's going to be happening, like, oh, look, this is going to happen, that's going to happen, etc., etc. But one way to go for the unpredictable is to sort of really imagine something wild and crazy and out of the ordinary happening. So going back to the idea of somebody ringing at the door, maybe it's a herd of cows kind of like wandering down the high street when he opens it. Maybe it's, somebody famous or something like that, or somebody, an alien or something like that. I don't know, something crazy. Let your imagination run wild. You may often, chapter 2 is kind of where we do introduce secondary characters who are key to the plot. So you may sort of find that, you add out any more layers or more characters or something like that. Basically, summary, start your second chapter with spice, with something maybe a bit unexpected, with maybe action, with dialogue. You can follow it on sequentially, or you can do a time jump. Most of all, make chapter 2 even more interesting than chapter 1. And what it should be doing in terms of story is just drawing the story more into the concrete goal that you've already established in chapter 1. So we set up the concrete goal. Chapter 2, maybe the main character has decided to take up the challenge of the concrete goal and they're already on the journey, like my character is. Or maybe chapter 2, they're resisting, in hero's journey terminology, they're resisting the call of action and they're fighting going. But chapter 2 is a continuation of the concrete goal, and in kind of literary terms, an opportunity to introduce your secondary characters who are going to be important to the story, and will be kind of propelling it along. Okay, any more comments? I'm just having a quick think, see if I can say, oh yeah, if you're writing this is the one thing, if you're writing a multi-character point of view novel where you've got lots of different characters telling the story, chapter 2 could be when you start writing it from there. So chapter 1 is written from Mary's perspective, chapter 2 could be written from Susan's perspective. And I think that's basically all I want to say with that, apart from just remembering it. We're not seeking perfection in these early chapters. You're already ahead of the game. You're just doing the best that you can with the tools at your disposal. So go easy on yourself and remember that you're beginning writing still. And if you want feedback on your second chapter, then please do upload it into the group for a hot seat or just for general review from myself and everybody else. And if somebody uploads their chapter, remember to hop in and just give them some moral support. Okay, good luck with your chapter 2s.